Thank you, Secretary Kerry, and thank you for your hard work and your leadership in assembling and helping steer the coalition against ISIL, and thank you for your presence with us today. I'm relieved we are having this debate, that we're having it in the open, and I believe the American people deserve and our values demand exactly this sort of a robust and open debate. And I think the Congress should not adjourn until we vote on an AUMF. We have raised important and difficult issues, and as you, Mr. Secretary, just commented, it's in large part because of the difficult history, the lessons learned from the cost and the reach and the scope and the complexity of our conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the 2001 and 2002 authorizations that were the foundation in some ways of those actions, that there are real concerns here. And I think this is the sort of debate, the sort of give and take between executive and legislative branches that our founders imagined. We have to, in many ways, re-examine and reset that relationship. Let me also just put on the table, I think, an important issue that hasn't been touched on so far, and an issue that is vitally important, not just for this committee, but for Congress to consider. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, according to a CRS report that just came out, there was a total of about $1.69 trillion requested to pay for the costs of those two wars. And as other members have commented, the Congress has two ways to restrain the executive in the conduct of long wars. First, the authorization or declaration of war, and second, how we fund them. And it is my hope, my expectation, that we cannot write another blank check for war, as was unfortunately the case under previous presidents and previous Congresses for previous conflicts. Paying for war is not just fiscally, but also morally responsible. It's not right to expect that the only people who sacrifice would be our troops and their families. And so expressly having a conversation about how to offset the cost of this war through a reduction in spending or an increase in revenue or both will help Americans have a more direct connection to the conflict and an awareness of its impact, not just in terms of our spending, but our steadily growing national debt. I'm aware this responsibility doesn't fall just on this committee, but it is the duty of the Congress as we debate the scope and strategy for this conflict to also look squarely at its cost and how to pay for it. And so I will continue to raise that issue as we move forward with the debate about the AUMF. Let me, Secretary Kerry, if I might, first just bear down on an issue that I don't think I've heard a clear and concise answer to. So if we're trying to come up with an AUMF that recognizes some of the challenges of the 2002 and that puts some restraint on the use of ground troops, and that strikes you as unacceptable in this effort, as you put it, to balance restraint against an open-ended conflict while allowing the President, the Commander-in-Chief, the flexibility to prosecute this conflict successfully. I think one of the reasons there remains real hesitation, real resistance to just an open-ended commitment to conduct of any kind is that we haven't had a full debate or discussion about the strategy. We can't go home and clearly defend what the strategy is, although you laid out the 5 core areas in which there's ongoing and effective activity. Could you accept an AUMF that was limited in time, as you discussed previously, and that initially had a limitation on large-scale ground combat, but required an examination of strategy and then a reconsideration of the AUMF to remove that limitation on the Commander-in-Chief's scope to conduct this and prosecute this war?
Well, I think by implication, the way the administration is looking at it, there's some restraint because the President has been pretty clear, and there's no current scenario that he would imagine where, I mean, if you're putting a restraint in time, you're automatically not getting into a long-term activity. So the 3 years is, in fact, the best automatic limitation on this problem of long-term. And if you have the right kind of formula for the trigger or for the, you know, I can think of several now, but I'm not going to go into them now. I don't think it's appropriate to do that here. But we could, you know, we could certainly sit down and bang out the ways that balance the interests, that create a sufficient level of review so you're certain you're going to get your whack at it, but it's not, you know, it's not self-limiting so that the wrong message is sent and you're not going to prosecute the war. Or whatever, you know, some people still have struggled with that terminology, but That's where I think it is. So I would suggest there is a balance, and I think we can work that out. I don't think you have to have the ground troop limitation by virtue of the 3-year peace.
Well, Mr. Secretary, I join many of my colleagues in both expressing a desire for a bipartisan AUMF and for a more robust and more broad discussion and debate about the strategy and what the direction is going to be. But I do want to make it clear that I support the conduct of this conflict against ISIL, that I think they are a real and present threat to the United States and our allies in the region, and I do think we should be supporting our armed forces. But weeks have turned into months since the War Powers notifications came up here, and I think this Congress needs to be more actively engaged in being accountable for authorizing this conduct. Let me move to one more question with the time I have. It was announced today roughly 1,500 soldiers from the international coalition against ISIL will join roughly 3,100 Americans in the train and equip mission in Iraq to train the Peshmerga and the ISF. How else will our coalition partners assist in the campaign? In a previous conflict in the region, many of our partners contributed significantly to the financial cost of the operations. Will we be complementing this training role with financial contributions from our allies and partners? And can you give us any further update on your expectations around ground troops? I was encouraged by your comment that many of our allies and the administration believe that non-U.S. ground troops are most likely to be effective in this conflict and in this context.
Well, the answer, Senator, is that the answer is yes. A number of countries are committed to providing financial input as well. To some degree, with some of them, that depends on what we choose to do. But the answer is yes, they are prepared to provide financial assistance and already are in some ways. For instance, the training facilities in some of their territory, they're taking care of. In addition to that, there will be a variance between countries as to who is doing what. As you know, 5 Arab nations are flying with us in the missions over Syria. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Jordan, and Qatar. And in addition to those 5, we have countries from all over the world who are contributing one way or the other, whether it's to training, providing direct assistance, providing humanitarian assistance, providing equipment, providing arms, and in some cases, presence on the ground, in the case of a number of our close allies, in the actual training activities. Australia is a case and example. Great Britain and others are doing that. So there is a full-fledged, broad-based engagement by many different countries in many different activities.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you.